So we start with the English Civil War and the Revolution. The Revolution had two camps. On one side we have the Catholic Royalists, who want King Charles to stay on the throne, and on the other side we have Oliver Cromwell, who wants there to be a democratic parliament ruling the country, and also happens to be a Protestant. So as we know with English history, the Catholics and the Protestants had already been arguing for a while. Cromwell won the fight, and he beheaded Charles I, and for a while England had no king. So for a while everything worked well. They established a parliament and they ran it. Oliver Cromwell took the position of being Lord Protectorate, and so he was kind of the head of state. And even though the Protestants were a little bit strict, the country ran smoothly. But when Oliver Cromwell died, his son wasn't as good a leader as he was, and he was unable to keep the country together. And this created an opening for Charles II, the king's son and obviously heir to the throne as far as the royalists were concerned, was able to reinstate his rule in a period known as the Restoration, because it restored the monarchy. So the new king settled old scores in a fairly childish way. So obviously a lot of people considered treasonists were killed, and they even dug up Oliver Cromwell's dead body and executed it again for treason by hanging it. So what are the values of a period like this? It obviously depends which side of the war you're on. So the Protestants valued democracy, but because of their Protestantism, they also had some very strict religious values. So they believed in decorum, they banned almost anything fun, including theatre and Christmas. When the Restoration took place, they were seriously depressed because they felt that they had achieved paradise on earth, they'd done their country a great service, and now it was all being taken away. The Catholic Royalists obviously supported the right of the monarch to rule the people, but they also supported the upper class and the indulgence that was associated with Catholicism. And so they reintroduced all that, and they reopened the theatres for something called Restoration comedy, which is pretty silly stuff really. It's usually got some sort of sexual themes, pie-in-the-face stuff as well, so very slapstick sort of comedy, and it involves the upper middle classes. So it's it's not what you'd call high literature. In thinking about the texts that came out of the Revolution and Restoration, well, very few literary minds are writing while people are having a civil war, so you don't get much out of the Revolution, but the Restoration brings Paradise Lost, which was written by John Milton. Now, this is one of the really, really important texts of this era. He originally worked for Cromwell and the parliamentarians, so obviously he supported democracy, and he wrote a lot of even things like the Constitution to help those who wanted democracy. And obviously also that means he was a Protestant, so politically and religiously very different from the time he was living in. Basically, Paradise Lost is a long poem about Adam and Eve, and the fact that they were tempted by Satan and thrown out of the Garden of Eden, which meant that they lost paradise, hence the title. But that is pretty much a parody for the loss felt by the Protestants. So of course they couldn't openly talk about how they felt because they'd get arrested for treason. So they had to come up with sort of a symbolic story to express all that. So that is what John Milton has hit on. In the story, he seems to sympathise with Satan, and he understands the feelings of desolation and loss about a failed cause. So that's where the Protestants were at. It's an important text not only because of what it is in itself, but it also influenced a lot of texts that came later on. So even if you're not prepared to read it, you should definitely read about it. Another famous writer of the Restoration is Aphra Behn. She's a very interesting lady indeed. She is the first female professional writer and a strong supporter of Charles II, which means that she's a Catholic and a royalist, and she even worked as his spy overseas in the Netherlands. She wrote plays and poems with playful sexual themes, which are obviously very popular in the Restoration, but she also copped a lot of flack for it because a lot of people felt that these were really inappropriate topics, but also really inappropriate topics to be written about by a woman. She also wrote a book called Orinoco, which was basically a story about when she went to South America. She met a slave trader there, and Orinoco is supposed to be a kind of Romeo and Juliet tale about a woman who gets taken into the slave trade and her husband that tries to save her. So it brought the unsavory reality of slavery home to England, but it also kind of presented the whole idea in a very different light as well. So these, again, are topics that women aren't supposed to be getting involved in. The other thing that made it interesting was that she presented this as non-fiction. So it's hard to know exactly how much of the story was true and how much she made up. Jonathan Swift is another person we're going to talk about here. Technically, you wouldn't necessarily branch him in the Revolution and Restoration people, but Swift's satire and political dissatisfaction really echoes well with the Restoration period. He's an Irish writer, and as we all know, the Irish had a lot of conflict with the English at this time. And he's famous for works like Gulliver's Travels, which satirically makes fun of the English and their view of the world and colonization and those sorts of things. And A Modest Proposal, which on the surface is an essay that promotes the idea that the Irish should eat their babies in order to save themselves from starving. So obviously Swift is a very critical opponent of English wealth and rule. So you can see that his dissatisfaction is probably coming from a very similar place to, say, John Milton's. So if you want to know more about this period, what do you read? Well, it'd be good to have a look at Paradise Lost, or at least to read about it. A Modest Proposal you should actually read, because once you get past the language, which is a little bit stuffy and old, it's a very funny story. Orinoco is another thing that perhaps you could read a synopsis of rather than reading the whole thing. But her poem, The Disappointment, which is again a very interesting one for a woman to be writing, is actually about a young maid who's in love with a shepherd and her disappointment in his lack of sexual prowess, which is obviously something that women never spoke about in this era. So you can read that one for free online, and it's probably well worth a look.